And that was Carrie Rodriguez and Ben Kyle singing Fire Alarm. And today we're talking about receiving and sharing information, and I've looked through all the latest news releases of scientific results that have come out on this topic, and so these are kind of straight, hot off the presses information for you guys about the latest happenings in science. And the next study that I want to talk about is ultrasound in hawkmoths, and this is a story that has been all over the science news because it's quite an unusual and exciting sort of thing. Quite weird, actually. A lot of people are saying this is, just so bizarre that it makes it kind of a fun story as well as an interesting one. So hawk moths are important pollinators because they have a really long proboscis, a really long nose that they're able to get into some really deep plants. And so they can be quite useful for reaching sorts of pollen that other species can't reach and then distributing that and helping plants propagate. So they are quite important in the ecosystem, but also they can be pests in some agricultural areas. So they're kind of good in some respects and bad in others. And these guys are, if you've ever seen one, you know they're quite large. Actually, if you kind of glance at one just quickly as it moves past, it looks very similar to a hummingbird. That's how big they are. And because of their size, they're often used as model organisms for genetic research in particular, because it makes it quite easy for scientists to access their genomes and access their cells because they are just kind of larger than other animals. And they are interesting in the wild as well, not just because of their genes in a laboratory. So they are the fastest and most talented flying insects that have been seen. They do have lots of control, and they are quite good at zipping around and kind of doing maneuvers in the air. So they are like hummingbirds, not just visually, but also in terms of how they move. And there are lots of them. So there are over 1,400 species of these guys worldwide. And the highest diversity out of anywhere in the world is in Malaysia, and that's where this current study was conducted. And what the researchers did was they went out and they captured a bunch of these hawk moths in the jungle using high energy lamps. So basically this works just like any lamp in your house whenever you accidentally attract the moths in through the open windows. That's exactly what they do out in the jungle, only the lights that they use are even bigger and brighter, and so you get moths coming from all over the place, sometimes from very long distances, and entering into these traps that allows them to be harvested. And once the moths were caught, the researchers then tethered them and placed them inside soundproof chambers. And they did this because they wanted to find out how the hawk moths were going to respond to the sounds of their potential predators. And their predators in this case were bats. And so what they did was they had these pre-recorded bat sounds of species that would be likely to be in the area of these particular types of hawk moths. And they were able to play these sounds using speakers that were inside those soundproof chambers. So the calls were piped in, and then they looked at the moths' responses. And they not only had cameras that allowed them to kind of look at the visual response of the moths, but they also had some microphones in there, so they were allowed to record whether they were acoustic responses of the moths as well. And indeed, what happened was when the moths heard these bat sounds, they used their genitalia to produce this really high-frequency sonic pulse. And it was both the males and the females that did this. So even though they have, potentially some sex differences there, they were both able to use their body parts in order to make these sonic pulses. And the researchers think that there are several different potential reasons for this behavior. So the primary thing that they think is most likely is that they use these sonic pulses to jam the echolocation signals of bats. And that could make it quite difficult for the bats to figure out where they're orienting in the environment. It can make it hard for them to locate the moths. It could just make it could generally confuse them and make it hard for them to kind of focus on what's going on. So basically, this is the same idea behind what the military does when they're trying to jam radar of unfriendly vessels. And it seems that potentially we could have this same type of thing happening in hawk moths. Now, it's also true that it could be a physical defense. If you've listened to the show before, then you'll know that sometimes certain types of sound can be very unpleasant and can cause damage. It can be awkward to listen to. It can affect you in lots of negative ways. And so it could be that this sonic pulse that the hawk moths are producing is quite unpleasant or even dangerous for the bats. And it might also be something that allows them to warn off, not to warn the bats themselves, but to warn other moths that the bats are around. So maybe it's a signal to other organisms in the habitat not unlike what I was just talking about earlier with the lemurs. Maybe there are these other signals where they're trying to warn their friends of potential predators in the area. And the reason that the scientists were looking for all of this, it wasn't just a shot in the dark, as you might imagine. It would be pretty far-fetched to think that this might happen a priori. But what happened was that previously in tiger moths, they have found that these guys have kind of a similar defense mechanism when they're exposed to their own predator sounds. And what they do is they use their tymbals, which are these membranes on the thorax that they can vibrate really rapidly. And they can use this as a defense mechanism, and it does seem to be that they're jamming the radar of the bats. And so that's why the researchers were looking for this in the hawk moths, and that's why that their primary suspicion is that probably there is this kind of negative effect on the echolocation abilities of the predatory bats. And this is quite an interesting thing, though, because obviously tymbals are quite different from genitalia, and you have to wonder, was this something that specifically emerged in order to have this effect on the bats, or was it something that the moths did anyway, and then they were able to use it to their advantage when the bats were approaching? What is the order in which this thing evolved? Is it something that was it just emerged by chance and then it became useful to them in these predatory situations? So obviously there's quite a lot of area there where more research can be done. Now these results are interesting not just because they're totally weird and kind of just funny to think about, but also because what researchers tend to do with these species, particularly insect species like moths, and particularly species that are in really biodiverse areas like jungles, is that they'll go out and they'll just collect loads and loads of them and put them in collections, and then not really have a whole lot of information to go with that. So the most they could do for a lot of these species is withdraw some DNA and do a genetic analysis and kind of see what genes are there, but then not really know much about how these animals actually act in their habitats, what other animals they encounter, what are the behaviors they use when those encounters take place. So this is a really cool thing where they're finally going to be able to match up this very interesting behavior with also the morphology of these animals and potentially the DNA data that they can collect and analyze in the future. And this will allow them to create kind of a more complete, what the researchers are calling library of life. And this could be really interesting, potentially even useful for further scientific analyses, whether they're focused on looking at conservation and having lots of genetic diversity in the world, or even in an application of some sort in terms of maybe our own human communication, communication of robots. There can be really unexpected applications of these things further on down the line. No end in sight, and you are listening to The Wild Side on Source FM 96.1. And today I am talking about receiving and giving information. So I'm thinking about animal communication and other reception of information from the habitat. And earlier I was talking a little bit about lemurs and hawk moths, and now I'm moving on to starfishes. So we have lots of diversity today in terms of organisms that we're looking at. So this week there has been a really exciting finding about sight in starfishes. And this is something that potentially fills in a big evolutionary gap that researchers have been investigating for quite a while. So that's why this is such an exciting result. So what researchers have known for a while now is that starfish, most species of starfish, have compound eyes in the tips of their arms. And you can actually see these even with an unaided eye. So if you find starfish of a certain size while you're out rock pooling, while you're out snorkeling, you can actually kind of see these little compound eyes right at the tips of their arms. And these are very similar to the compound eyes that we see in arthropods. And these arthropod structures are called ommatidia. And like I said, these have been known about actually for centuries, but researchers have never previously found that these eyes actually helped the starfish orient and navigate. Now they realized that they did have photoreceptors, so they were able to, kind of tell whether there was light in the environment or not, but it didn't seem to help them actually see an image of something in much resolution and use that image to actually do something and to modify their behavior accordingly. However, recently, these scientists that were studying these starfish decided to perform an actual experiment. And of course, experiments tend to be a lot more useful than just plain old observation, because it really allows you to, they really allow you to test a specific hypothesis and to create a scenario where you would have often a very clear-cut yes or no type of answer, in the best studies anyway. And that's exactly what these guys came up with. So what they did was they found coral reefs that had starfish on them, and they took the starfish off and plopped them in the sand about a meter away. And that doesn't seem like very far, but of course if you're a starfish and you don't move very quickly, you don't swim very well, then obviously it is going to take you a while to get back, and you have lots of motivation to do that because there isn't any food in the sand. So if the starfish want to get food again, they're going to have to orient out of that habitat and get themselves back up to the reef where they have a nice safe place to sit and they have access to food resources. And the interesting thing about this was that some of the starfish involved in this study had eyes that were intact on the ends of their arms, and others of them did not. And so this allows you to then set up this distinction where, theoretically, if these eyes allow the starfish to do something, then the starfish that have the intact eyes at the ends of their arms should go back towards the reefs, whereas the starfish without the eyes should show some other behavior, whether that's maybe going in the opposite direction or wandering around randomly, or maybe just going to a sunny patch, but not necessarily a good sunny patch that has food. And indeed, that is what the researchers found, so that the starfish that had eyes went straight back towards the reefs, but the ones without the eyes didn't really show any pattern at all. So they didn't seem to understand where they were and where they needed to go to get back home. And these results are really exciting because they suggest that actually the starfish nervous system is not just processing the absence or presence of light, but in fact there is real visual information that's coming in. So the starfish are able to see something, although we don't yet quite know what that is, and use that something to help them get from one place to another. And this also means that, specifically the circulatory system and the central nervous system of the starfish are probably much more advanced than we previously realized, because they have to work together in order to allow these things to happen in the starfish, to allow this visual information to be received and processed in some way, and then turned around into some sort of appropriate behavioral response. And not only is this likely true for starfish, but possibly for other echinoderms as well. So starfish are just one of many species in this whole family called echinoderms. And since they are all related and therefore have some shared traits, then it's reasonable to think that some of these other species might also be able to do similar sorts of things, and we've just not realized it all of this time. And you might think, well, it's been a really long time that we've known about these organisms and we've seen them, so surely we must have seen this by now if it's going to happen. But the truth is that these things live in environments that are quite hard for us to access comfortably or for long periods of time. We don't have, tons and tons of these things in captivity where we can see them really easily. Even when they are in those places, they might not have the motivation or the need to show these sorts of behaviors. And when you're not testing for something explicitly, then you might just never see it because you're not actually out there looking for it. So there are lots of reasons why we might have overlooked this in starfish specifically, but also in other echinoderms. So this opens up, just like I was saying earlier, this study opens up a whole new range of studies that can be done, and that's one of the great things about really good science. Not only does it answer kind of one question, it raises lots of other questions that you can then go and explore and start to find out more information about. And that's actually kind of really exciting when you're a scientist, because it means that you're never going to get bored and you're never going to run out of stuff to look at. So some people might interpret that as a weakness because it means you now have lots of other work to do, but actually that is kind of what drives a lot of us, I think. So anyway, sorry, a bit of a tangent there. What's another further bit of excitement about this result in starfishes is that the eyes seem to be potentially an intermediate stage, or a missing link, if you like, between two types of photoreceptors that had been previously identified. And one of these is called the rhabdomeric photoreceptor, which is what we find in arthropods, and the other is the ciliary photoreceptor, which is what vertebrates like ourselves have. And there was this kind of gap between those two things. So, yes, they both are photoreceptors. They can tell whether there's light around. But there was kind of a big break between those two things. And you think, well, how did the one transition into the other during evolution? And so actually, this result in the starfish suggests what this intermediate photoreceptor might have looked like during evolution. It might in fact be very close to that original thing that those first early species were starting to develop as they experienced the shift from the rhabdomeric to the ciliary photoreceptor as they evolved into these other branches of the animal kingdom. And that's really exciting because that means that we could begin to study these species in order to understand how these structures could have evolved and also why. So just kind of physically, what were the constraints or what were the pressures that kind of forced this sort of process to happen? What were the genes that were involved in this and the mutations and the other physical changes that might have allowed these structures to evolve? But also, what were the behavioral and environmental causes of this evolution? So for example, is it because these animals needed to navigate towards preferred habitat? Was it because they needed to find food? Was it because they were under pressure from predators and needed to be able to hide? And we don't know any of those things. But now that we have this kind of first piece of the puzzle, we can maybe start to look at other appropriate species to study, other appropriate habitats where we might find these sorts of situations where maybe these kinds of pressures are there right now as we speak. We can look at the genetic evidence, and we can start to put all these other pieces together to make the puzzle a bit more of a clear picture. So this is a really neat result in these organisms that actually are pretty understudied as far as species go. So from starfishes, I then want to move on to another kind of quick study. So some of these are quite brief, I realize, and that's because there are some papers out there that tend to be quite short and to the point. The researchers have really well-developed research projects, and so I can just kind of summarize them quite easily. So I have a bunch here today to talk about. And the next one I want to talk about is actually not a study that's been published yet, but it's one that's about to come out at a conference this summer. And so the researcher and his university have released a press release that explains all of the results of this particular study. And unfortunately, because it is so preliminary, that means there aren't a whole lot of details about this research, but it is kind of a cool thing, so I wanted to mention it anyway, because it does pertain to people, and that is something that people always tend to find kind of interesting, to think of us as study subjects. And this particular study was interested in looking at the relationship between social signaling, various different types of social signaling, and also vocalizations. So kind of thinking about both physical or visual signals that we produce, but also vocalizations that we produce. And they were interested in looking across both mammals and birds because there are lots of similarities in how these two groups communicate. In fact, if you've listened before to the show, then you'll probably remember that I've said at one point that often when researchers study baby birds and look at the development of vocalizations in young birds, they're hoping to use that information to apply it to the development of speech in humans. So there are these ties that seem to connect across all of these different species, even though we are obviously quite distinct. So what these researchers were hoping to do was to figure out the connections between social signaling and vocalizations across all mammals and all birds, and how are these connections made, why do we have these connections, and how are they similar between these two groups? Also, why would these two groups have so many similarities? And one really intriguing connection, just to give you an idea of what I mean by this kind of social signaling plus vocalization thing, one thing that they were really interested in looking at was gesticulating. And gesticulating is quite an unusual thing because there really seems to be no reason why we would do it. And yet there are all sorts of people who do it even in situations when they shouldn't, or when it actually wouldn't be to any advantage. And one really great example of this is studies of congenitally blind people have found that these individuals, even though they cannot see, will use these hand gestures. So they've never seen anyone else do it, but they're doing it themselves. And they'll also do it when they're speaking to each other. So even though they know they're speaking to someone else who can't see, they'll still make these gestures, which seemingly are being used to try to help them get their point across. But why would you do this if the person you're talking to can't even see you do that at all? And we see this in other situations as well, even with people who are able to see, but they're talking to people that can't see them back. So when you're talking on the phone, you'll often gesticulate. I'm gesticulating right now, even though I'm sitting all by myself in a radio studio and you can't see me. So this is really something that tends to happen for no real reason at all. And researchers thought maybe there was an evolutionary reason behind this connection. Maybe when we vocalize, there's some sort of an evolutionary connection between the vocalizations and these kind of physical structures, and these morphological structures, and maybe that's why we're doing all of this. So they wanted to look way back at a distant ancestor of both mammals and birds. Because if we all evolved from that distant ancestor, then maybe there was something in that organism that created this connection, and then that was passed down to all of us so that we have it as well. And the reason they wanted to look at fish was that fish produce sound with their swim bladders. And swim bladders are gas-filled organs that will help the fish maintain buoyancy. And you might have seen these if you've gone fishing before and then had to cut open and fillet a fish. Well, the gas-filled organs can also be used as resonating chambers. And the way that the fish achieve these noises, these resonations, is to rapidly beat their muscles against the bladder. Or sometimes they have muscles within the bladder that they can rapidly beat as well. And so all of that drumming produces the sound that the fish use to communicate with each other. Now, what's interesting about this is that the fish use those same muscles often for moving around. So here you've got a single set of structures that can have two functions, and one function is physical movement, and the other function is communication. And this seems to be, kind of a logical reason why we might have gesticulation. And so what the researchers did then was look into the neural network associated with these structures. And what they found was that both of these functions within a fish were regulated by a single portion of the fish neural network, and that's the hindbrain. And so what this suggests is that you've got this structure in the brain that is used to regulate all of these behaviors at once. And so this one single structure will combine two behaviors that you wouldn't ordinarily have linked up in any way, because they don't really seem to function together for any real purpose. So when the fish began to evolve and change into species that would eventually become us, they passed on this hindbrain characteristic. It may have been something that was advantageous at the time, and so that's why it was passed on. Or maybe it didn't have a specific advantage, but it also wasn't harmful, and so it was just never selected against, and that's why it remained. Either way, whatever happened, this hindbrain activity was passed down from generation to generation, from one species to the next, and potentially that is why we find ourselves gesticulating today. It's because there's this ancient connection between this physical movement and these vocalizations, or acoustic communication, I should say, because obviously the fish aren't vocalizing per se. But there is this ancient connection that potentially could also be used to explain other related brain and body activity, whether that's stuff that's in the hindbrain or stuff that's in other areas of the brain as well. So there might be other sorts of things where we find couplings of behaviors that you wouldn't really think should ordinarily go together. They're not really potentially useful in that coupling, but potentially all these things result from just wiring that is close to each other or very similar in some way, and so is easy to kind of link up, and that's why you have these things happening at the same time. Also, what researchers are really hoping was that this information could begin to help us understand even better how language evolved to begin with. So now that we kind of potentially have this understanding of the region of the brain that was associated with these first vocalizations or communications, we can see how we got from that kind of just using our body parts to make sound to getting more and more complex with how we do that and transferring away from a swim bladder into our voices and our mouths, and then coming up with complex grammar and all these other rules that we use for making language. So potentially now that we've got a bit more understanding of that original brain activity that was involved in this, we could begin to really understand the huge leap that was made over time from fish to apes to us speaking as clearly and remarkably as we do today. That was Queen with Body Language, and today on The Wild Side we are talking about communication, or I guess to be more accurate, we're thinking about receiving and sending signals and the transfer of information. But kind of a nice shortcut for that is communication. So the next thing I want to talk about is the result of a recent study that looked at fish responses to alarm calls. And basically most fish will transmit a lot of information using what we would call olfactory cues. But they're basically chemical cues that can be spread through the water, and then the fish will receive these. You can call them taste buds, you can call them olfactory cells, whatever you want to call them. The fish are sensing these chemicals. It's the same way that we taste food, but also the same way that we would smell nice scents, like smelling all the flowers that are in bloom right now. And what's happening in the water is that, the water molecules are really good for allowing this stuff to kind of flow around from one place to another, for dissolving these chemicals and sending them right into the fish so that the fish can sense them. But that isn't going to work quite as well if you've got other stuff in that water as well. So the contaminants, whatever they may be, whether they're from humans, whether they're natural, they can bind to these chemicals and prevent the chemicals from interacting with the fish, or they can bind to the fish so that the scent chemicals can't be sensed in some way, or they can cause basically any number of problems that you can think of that would in some way interfere with the fish's ability to sense these chemicals, whether they're from other fish, whether they're from the environment itself and they're kind of just using it to orient or to tell what sort of things are out there. Maybe they're even from predators that might give off a particular compound that they can use to recognize predators and hide. There are any number of things that the fish might be trying to notice and detect in the environment. And so you might think, of course this is going to be a really important process for them, and if they've got something in the water that is coming in between them and their ability to sense those things and respond appropriately, then it might be quite dangerous for them. And one of the things that researchers have been quite worried about is heavy metals that have been introduced into the water. And there are all kinds of studies that look at different metals that get into the water from mining activity naturally, because these ores are just located in the ground and eventually they will leach out, or maybe the wind and the water will come and kind of break down whatever other rock and soil are keeping these things in place, and then that releases them to flow through the habitat. Whatever the case might be, these things are out there and they can get into the water. And we know that humans, of course, are inadvertently doing lots of this. As we burn fossil fuels, for example, as we do harvest things from the ground, we tend to let these things out. And so, natural levels are expected to be kind of what they always have been, more or less, but with the increase in human activity in terms of releasing these into the environment, this can be a real problem. And you might think, if these things have a native effect, if they have a large effect, then we need to try to monitor our activity and reduce our activity so that it doesn't interfere with these animals' abilities to kind of function in the wild. But of course, before you get to that stage of thinking about management and preservation, you have to actually figure out, is there really going to be a problem at all? And that's what these researchers were doing. And before the break, I mentioned that the last study I talked about was it was something that had been talked about in a press release, and so there wasn't a whole lot of information. And that is the same for this. So I don't have lots of nitty-gritty details about what happened in this study, because it's just about to be discussed at an upcoming conference, and then the researchers will publish a paper at some point after that. But it is quite an interesting thing, and so I thought I would mention it even though there aren't lots of details just yet. So what these scientists did was they looked at fathead minnows, and minnows are a common study species in fish because they're quite easy to get, they're quite easy to keep in captivity. They do a lot of behaviors that other fish show as well, so you can kind of use these results to make educated guesses about how other species would also react to similar conditions. So what they did was they wanted to look at how these minnows responded to danger signals in water that was contaminated. And the danger signals that they were interested in were signals that were being produced by other species, other members of their own species that had been exposed to a predator. And they didn't actually do this, they didn't let this just happen naturally. They actually set up an experiment, so they kind of mimicked this situation rather than actually just letting it develop on its own. So what they did was they took skin extracts from fellow fish species and introduced those into the water. And this would mimic what would happen if the fish themselves were in the water, making these signals available to other fish around them in the environment. And the researchers also were monitoring the neural activity of the fish in question so they could see how their brains responded to the presence of odors in the environment. And the environment in question was one that was either completely uncontaminated, or one that had copper, and one that had nickel, or one that had both copper and nickel. And so what they found was that fish in the copper-contaminated water, but not unexposed fish or fish in the nickel-exposed water, were having difficulty with their olfaction. And basically what happened was that as soon as the copper was in the water, the fish weren't responding as they should. They weren't turning around and running away from the area where these theoretical predators were available. And that's what they should do, because if they sense that they have fellow fish that are kind of panicking, or that potentially have been eaten and therefore have released these compounds from their skin because their skin is being munched on by a predator, then what they should do is run away or do some sort of predator evasion type behavior to help them increase their chances of survival. And this was not found at all in these fish. And this is quite troubling because it means that if there are areas that have lots of copper that is leaching out into the streams, then this could be a real problem for the fish populations, because you could just have them quite easily being eaten up by predators or caught by humans, depending on what species we're talking about. And this over time could have really big impacts on the whole habitat, because if you've got these concentrations of copper in a particular spot and you've got whole populations of fish beginning to die off because of this, then in certain stretches of stream or in certain streams as opposed to others that are nearby, you might just suddenly have the fish populations completely dying out, and obviously that's not a very good thing. And the reason that these researchers were looking at copper specifically as opposed to any of the other metals that you might think about was that it is something that's naturally found throughout the environment, and it can be released during industrial activities, and so it is something that humans are known to kind of increase in the habitat. And previous studies have found that copper can have negative effects on lots of other species, ranging from bacteria all the way up to humans, so it seemed quite logical that it might also affect species like fish. So that is something that potentially is interesting to keep an eye on in order to kind of work on conservation, to think about management, and to protect these fish that are not just important in the ecosystem, but also potentially important to us, because of course a lot of us do like to eat fish, and so this could be a problem not just in streams and rivers, but also out in the ocean, and could have a big effect on the fishing industry potentially. But of course all of that is stuff that's down the road and has to be researched more as the researchers go on with this particular study and looking up kind of the follow-up sort of things and see what the implications will be. Now the final topic that I want to address today is another study that kind of has implications for humans and is quite interesting because I think it's something that a lot of us can relate to. And this is a study that looked at the effects of hunger on decision-making and risk perception. And you'll probably have experienced some point in your past where you've been a bit hungry and that's made you cranky. If you've ever watched the show Mythbusters, where Adam Savage is always talking about how he has to have a cookie whenever he gets grumpy, and then he's immediately happy as soon as he has the cookie and he's no longer grumpy. Well, it is kind of a standing joke on the show, but it is also something that scientists are really familiar with. There is this well-established connection between how animals behave and how much food they've had, and how much food also is available in the environment to have in the future. So there is this kind of wiring that affects us and causes us to be slaves to our hunger in some sense. So one of the things that researchers have previously found is that both hunger and fullness are associated with our willingness to take risks. So for example, predators are more likely to hunt really dangerous prey only when they've reached the point of starvation. And then once they've gotten to that point and they really have to eat food, they throw caution to the wind and they just go after whatever it is they can find. There have also been studies in people that have found, for example, that humans who have been fed pretty well and then are placed in a situation where they can gamble money or not, The ones that are more sated are less likely to take risks, but the ones that are still hungry are more likely to take risks. And you can see where this would pay off in the end on an evolutionary scale, because if you are in that situation of great need, and you are more likely to go out there and just throw caution to the wind and do whatever needs to be done, then there could be an extremely high payoff, because if you do get whatever that reward is that you need, then you're going to live to see another day. But if you are in that really hungry state and you don't go the extra mile and take a leap of faith and try to get whatever you need, then you could end up dying because you starved to death. So there is some precedent for why there would be this connection. But what hasn't really been known in the past is how the brain mediates all of this. How does the brain know whether to tell us to go ahead and be wild and crazy, or whether to just kind of toe the line and play it safe for as long as we can? And so researchers have performed this really interesting study on fruit flies in order to try to understand this. And the thing with fruit flies, and why they're really interesting, is that normally when they perceive carbon dioxide in the air, they will take flight, because this is potentially a sign of danger, and so they need to hide from it. But the food that they eat is often indicated by the emission of carbon dioxide. So they like rotting fruit and rotting plants, and as those plants rot, they release carbon dioxide into the air. So here you've got this weird dichotomy, where you've got the flies wanting to go away from carbon dioxide, but also needing to go towards it if they want to feed. And so that means that their brains have this constant conflict that they have to kind of sort out in order to tell the flies what they need to do in any particular circumstances. And so to look at this a bit further and to look at the neural aspects of it, researchers took these flies and put them in different environments. And one environment had carbon dioxide only, and one environment had carbon dioxide and the smell of food. And some of the flies that were put in these areas were hungry, and others had been fed. So here you've got these kind of 4 situations, and they wanted to look at how these things interacted. How did smell interact with hunger state? And what they found was that the flies that were hungry overcame their aversion to carbon dioxide much faster than flies that had been fed, but only in environments where there was a smell of food. So in other words, they were willing to take a greater risk, but only when they knew there was a food reward in that area. And what happens, it looks like, the researchers were able to look into the brains of the flies. And so what they think is that there are these brain regions called the mushroom bodies. And the mushroom bodies receive olfactory information and are really important in learning and memory, and specifically learning and memory associated with smells. And these shouldn't traditionally be involved in carbon dioxide avoidance, because this is an innate behavior, and so it shouldn't involve any learning. But when the researchers disabled the cells in the mushroom bodies, what they found was that hungry flies no longer responded to the carbon dioxide at all, but there was no change in response to the fed flies. So this allowed them to then go on and identify a specific neuron that was involved in transporting the information about the carbon dioxide situation in the environment to the mushroom body. And this then went on to stimulate activity in the hungry animals, but not in the fed animals, which indicated that there were 2 completely different pathways that were being activated. So there were these parallel pathways, and one or the other would turn on depending on whether or not there was the carbon dioxide in the environment. And this is really exciting because it does suggest that we have these very similar circuits in our brains, or at least that the flies do, and it's likely that we have something similar. And whether or not one of them gets activated is dependent on how full the animals are and how much in need of food they are. And this then means that metabolism and hunger are affecting brain processing centers. And if they do it to this one brain processing center, then it's quite likely that they might do it to other processing centers as well, and therefore also impact other behaviors that animals engage in. And it's also likely that there are other external conditions that could have similar neural effects. So it's not probably just going to be limited to carbon dioxide, but probably other cues from the environment as well. So that is the last study that I have today to talk about on the topic of receiving and sharing information. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the latest cutting-edge scientific research. I'm a bit close to the time limit, but I'm going to go ahead and finish with a bit of a song anyway. So I will leave you with Eric Carmen singing Hungry Eyes from the Dirty Dancing soundtrack.